Welcome to today's Energy Central Power session entitled Safeguarding Critical Infrastructure, Enhancing Hacker Detection. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's event, Nozomi, for making our event possible. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to the moderator of today's event, Dick Brooks, to kick things off. Dick, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, PJ, and welcome everyone. First, I want to thank everyone for coming today to today's power session hosted by Energy Central. These are, if you've ever attended one before, they're a lot of fun to be part of. So, welcome. So before we get into it, I just want to take a moment and talk a little bit about what's going on in our industry. And so, as we all know, the hacker community continues to innovate and find creative ways to disrupt critical infrastructure that is becoming more reliant on digital technologies. So Typhoon is one example of a sophisticated, stealthy attack targeting real-time operational systems used to manage critical infrastructure operations that must be detected before it can be used to disable key infrastructure, such as the electric grid. So it's imperative that critical infrastructure operators maintain visibility over communications between network devices within a trust zone and detect malicious activity that has circumvented perimeter controls. FERC's INSM Order 887 facilitates the detection of anomalous network activity indicative of an attack in progress, thus increasing the probability of early detection and allowing for quicker mitigation and recovery from attack. It's important to understand the various challenges that come with INSM solutions for operational technology and real-time operations, which are time-sensitive and resource-constrained. The solutions discussed in this session today have been designed with these unique OT constraints and sensitivities in mind, in order to produce an effective solution that will not impact real-time functions and performance and provide early detection of hacker activity. So before we get started, let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. Ronnie, would you kick us off there?
Yep, thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Ronnie Fredericks. I'm a field CTO at Nozomi Networks and have been with the company for about 6.5 years. My background started in an energy company called Exelon out of Baltimore. I was in their security operations center for about 3 years doing network security monitoring, digital forensics, incident response, and some threat intel. And took it over to the private side on the IT side for a bit, and then came back to OT with Nozomi 6.5 years ago. So I'm more than happy to be on this call and to hopefully answer any questions you guys have and educate and have a healthy discussion here. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Ronnie. Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Dick, and thanks for having me as part of this panel. My name is Josh Sandler. I work as the Energy Cybersecurity Regulatory Lead at EY, and I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Myself and my team work on various cyber regulations that affect the energy sector, most notably keep ourselves pretty busy with TSA pipeline directives as well as the NERC CIP standards. Overall, got my career started working in power and utility space about 20 years ago. As a controls engineer, happened to work at a small coal-fired power plant in Terre Haute, Indiana. Grew up doing controls engineering, working at various generation facilities, gas, coal, hydro, pump storage, before I kind of fell backwards, leading a couple cybersecurity projects in about 2008, 2007 timeframe. And that was looking at a couple black start facilities that needed to become compliant with NERC CIP version 1. So I've been involved with the NERC CIP standards, not quite since the urgent action days, but since pre-implementation of the version 1 set of NERC CIP. I did spend 8 years following that, working at that utility, working in OT cybersecurity programs, working in the NERC CIP program, building, automating, testing, maturing that program. Came over to EY in 2017. Been here for 7 years now. Gives me an opportunity to work with a wide range of organizations, vendors, small, large utilities, whether those are investor-owned, government, co-ops, munis, whatever it might be. So looking forward to the conversation today. And Dick, turn it back to you.
Thank you, Josh. And I'm Dick Brooks. I'm the lead software engineer at Business Cyber Guardian and a co-founder. And I think many people on this platform or Energy Central community know me. I want to thank you all for topping 900,000 views of my Energy Central content. So thank you all for following along. I appreciate your support. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go through a series of questions here, folks, and we'll see if we can give you some greater insights into what this session is all about. So let's start with the first question. What do you see as the biggest challenge utility organizations will face when adopting the INSM requirements from NERC and FERC?
Yeah, Dick, maybe I'll take that one first. So there's definitely a couple different directions to maybe take that question even. Certainly on the technical side, there's going to be the question that the utility faces as far as what the best, most cost-effective method to potentially to identify that potentially anomalous network activity, how that's going to be analyzed, how it's going to be responded to appropriately. There's also going to be that challenge of performing network monitoring in environments where we haven't historically seen a lot of that being done. When we're talking about the generation plants, when we're talking about the transmission substations, those are environments that we haven't normally seen a lot of current, cybersecurity network-based monitoring, whereas you might have normally seen that a little bit more in the control center space. But in those field environments, the concept of what is normal, what does that baseline level of traffic look like, isn't necessarily fully understood or recognized. So being able to parse out what is potentially anomalous from what is normal requires us to kind of fully understand first what is normal supposed to be. But I do kind of think that the biggest challenge is probably going to be on the compliance side of it. The way the CIP 15 standard is drafted is it's intentionally ambiguous. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge. We've seen a few different examples in the history of NERC CIP where that intentional ambiguity has come back to bite the industry a little bit, and where it's caused just a lot of churn and updates and revisions to the standards that can be disruptive to an organization to try to respond to. We saw that a lot with CIP 2. CIP 2 changed from what was originally developed as we're going to allow the industry to take a risk-based approach to the identification of facilities and devices and then protect those, to what we now have as a bright line. We saw a very similar concept start to happen in the physical security standards in CIP 14. And so when we kind of apply that lens now to CIP 15, we're seeing a similar origin story. We're seeing that we're once again left with a standard that is asking the industry to first themselves self-identify potential areas of risk and to apply methods to those areas to help mitigate against the risks that we see. And so while certainly we can appreciate and benefit from having that flexibility, we are also now presented with an opportunity for auditors to formulate their own opinions and to formulate their own perspectives of where that risk might be and whether or not the utility got it right. And so it just presents a potential challenge point for the industry. So it's going to be incumbent upon those utilities to develop a defendable process and a defendable position about where it's identifying its risks and how it's identifying those risks and where those mechanisms can be deployed to help detect that anomalous traffic. Defendable is going to be that key word. because it isn't just going to be about having a developed process and then having those controls implemented, but then being able to defend those in a conversation with an auditor who may not be familiar with the environment, may not be familiar with the risk profile, whatever it's going to be. So as with anything NERC CIP, it's going to be a learning curve, both from a technical perspective and a compliance perspective. And that's going to be on all sides of the equation, whether we're talking about the utilities, whether we're talking about the auditors, whether we're talking about the security vendors, whether we're talking about the security consultants, any other players in this space. And we're going to potentially see evolution in the standards as a result. I know we're probably going to talk a little bit about that later, but we may lose some of that flexibility that we actually have today as a result of just the inconsistencies that we may expect through this first iteration.
Thank you, Josh. Ronnie, did you have any add-on to that?
Not much. I would say, from what Josh said, just to piggyback off the main point being on the vendor side and more directly, working with implementing some of these processes as they come into play is time, because a lot of times, the time frame on when things can get done, how efficiently they can get done, standards will change or new ones will come out as we start to make progress on one. And then, like I said, just repeating what Josh said, is knowing what's there, being able to have an accurate inventory and knowing where to start is also going to vary by even within the same vertical. One company may not be as mature as another or have the resources really to do that. So having that sort of relation between vendor and regulatory and the cybersecurity folks, as well as the end users, is all, everyone working together is where I've seen the most success in terms of getting things done accurately and at a timely manner. So.
Thank you, Ronnie. Yeah, I can say from, just from my time working, I was at ISO New England as the enterprise architect, and I can tell you that there are a lot of different protocols running in those OT environments, and they're not really easy they're not intuitive, I can tell you that much, first off. So having the ability to see what's actually happening down there at those lower levels is extremely important, but a difficult challenge at the same time. So thanks for that, guys. So what steps should cybersecurity and compliance teams take now to prepare for audits in a post-INSM world?
Yeah, certainly, one of the promising things about this upcoming CIP 15 standard is we get the benefit of a relatively long implementation period that I think is a bit of an outlier when it comes to some of the NERC CIP standards. We haven't started the clock yet. We're still pending FERC approval, but if and when that does come, we're going to have 3 years to be compliant for control center environments, but we're going to have 5 years to be compliant for the field locations, those medium impact environments that have external routable connectivity or ERC. But as with all things that we've seen, you're going to need that time. That amount of time is going to be necessary for organizations, even starting that journey now, if you don't already have anything currently in place. And that's working with solution providers. That's working with the security vendors to understand what methods are available to those utilities to address the risks that they might be faced with. Certainly, Dick, as you mentioned, having multiple protocols, some of which are encrypted. How are we going to be able to monitor all those different network feeds in a multitude of different environments, potentially all within the same organization, and start to really validate and test our architectures and roll those out with enough time to understand the baseline. And I kind of mentioned this before, but there's going to be a period of time for a lot of these technologies that may aid in our ability to detect anomalous activity to first understand what that normal baseline looks like. So that happens over time, and it happens over multiple different points in the year, or different levels of network traffic, or different operations happening. And so understanding what all those types of events can look like on a network layer will just take that time that we're given to understand what baseline is, and hopefully tune our tools to avoid those false positives, those false negatives that we might see throughout the implementation. And then we're going to need to test and mature our practices over time. What I've seen in our more mature organizations and clients is those that do periodic testing of their security and compliance posture, whether that's through internal means, internal audits, reviews, whether that's external providers. It's trying to identify gaps and inefficiencies that can be remediated, such that when it comes time for audit, where we should have previously uncovered anything that could be an issue.
Thank you, Josh. Ronnie?
Yep, thank you. So with, what you can do now to prepare for these is, right within the order itself, it does mention a couple different things. I think there was 4 specifically. It mentioned like anti-malware, firewalls, IDS, and IPS. So, without assuming the maturity of the different networks of the folks on the call, some places already have some of those things in place. Some may have nothing or half of that. So first, just from the document itself, just going through and checking off to say, do I have these in place? Do the tools I have, are they able to collect, detect, and analyze things? And then if not, that's a good place to start, because obviously that would be something that would be coming up in an INSM audit, since it's right there in the document itself. But if you do have some of those things or already have them in place, like I said before, having that relationship between the vendor, the tools, the implementers as well, to make sure you're fully utilizing it to its maximum potential. Just because within the INSM standards, it also says you should be able to have the traffic, log it, collect it, store it, and then be able to implement measures later to analyze it. So whether it's through using an IDS or a combination of everything, a lot of times I see folks that have tools that they just purchase because of these compliance standpoints, and they never utilize it to its full potential, or some places use it at all, right? So if you have it, maximize it, as well as put your pressure on to the vendors and the regulators themselves to say, hey, what are you guys doing to adhere to these new standards that are coming out? I bought X, Y, and Z, or I have this. You say you're a security platform. I expect you to also, keep things up to date and evolve as the different standards evolve themselves too. So keep that pressure on the vendors themselves. And if there's a reason that isn't happening, ask yourself that question: am I fully comfortable and safe with what I'm using today? So I think just analyzing everything in the INSM standards, as well as kind of doing a cross-reference of what you're using or doing today to implement that, to make sure, hey, if this is our deployment strategy, is it checking off all these boxes, as well as leaving room for growth for something that may change or come tomorrow? So I think just having a proactive outlook on that is where a good place is, where people.
Thank you, Ronnie. And we did get a comment in the chat that I want to share with you. And so some people are saying, having better guidance would improve the design process. And I totally agree with that. In fact, when I worked at ISO New England, I would typically, when a new CIP standard came out, I would go look at the RSAWs that came out that advise the auditors how to proceed with their audits on these various standards. So if you haven't done that, by all means, go get those RSAWs and look through them so you know what the auditors are looking at in terms of their own guidance. But the other thing I did too was common. I ran the enterprise architecture group, and we would bring in vendors to come in and talk to us about what they did to solve some of these challenges or these problems. And so by all means, reach out to the vendor community and ask them to come in and talk to you about what they're doing so that you can see what's available and then even do some planning at that time. So don't be afraid to reach out to those vendors and to look through those RSAWs. Okay,
yeah,
next
Dick, another source of potential information there is, especially considering where we are today in a point of time where FERC has yet to, issue a NOPR, issue a final ruling on approving the standard. There's definitely going to be context in those filings that FERC does as far as what their expectations are and as far as how they read some of the standards. Understand that they're not the ones who are often the auditors in a lot of cases. Sometimes they are participating and sometimes they are leading audits. So there's definitely some insight in, and they can be a couple hundred pages and can be a little dry at times, but those filings do provide additional context for, what FERC thinks and how they think as far as, what the expectations are and what they see as being successful, or potentially where there's pitfalls in the potential standards where things might be missed, or they might start to even tip their hand as far as what may come in the future, as far as we're going to keep our eyes on how this is going to get implemented and might be a source for FERC to consider a future directive of where the standard may evolve.
Great point, Josh. Yeah, I've had both FERC and NERC come in for a visit. You never know who's going to show up the next day and say, "Hi, we want to talk to you about X." But good point, Josh. Thank you. Next question is, how do the new standards integrate with other NERC CIP standards, and what are the best practices for a holistic approach to cybersecurity?
Yeah, so definitely a few direct and indirect integrations with some of the other NERC CIP standards that are already in place. First, that I think is one of the more obvious ones is CIP 8. That's our cybersecurity incident response plans. There's not a formal tie between CIP 15 and CIP 8, but there's an implication in CIP 15 that if something anomalous is detected, that the organization is going to do something about it. And we already have some processes in place for how to respond to cybersecurity incidents. Now, what we might not have is the playbooks specific to various tools and methods that may get implemented as a result of the INSM standards. So there might be some updates that are needed. But for the most part, the overall triage, response, reporting processes are something that can be leveraged. We do have other cybersecurity monitoring requirements in place for CIP 5, which are kind of focused more on network boundaries, what's going into or out of our network zones. We do have them in CIP 7 that are more endpoint focused. So we're now kind of filling a gap in CIP 15 for monitoring maybe lateral network traffic or other zones of within those boundaries for potential anomalous activities. So it isn't quite okay, we can just do what we did in CIP 5 or do what we did in CIP 7 and we're covered, because we're going to have potentially different methods and different solutions here. But the concepts of doing monitoring already exist, and there's potentially things that we can leverage or potentially even lessons learned that a utility may have had going through that implementation, going through several years potentially of audits to know maybe what to expect in an audit, to know what to expect when an alert does come through and on how to respond to those. And then we're also considering CIP 11. And CIP 11 covers protection of BES cyber system information, BCSI. Whether or not we're going to call the data that we're collecting for purposes of INSM BCSI, it may or it may not be. But there's requirements, specifically, I think it's requirement 3 in the CIP 15 standard, that obligates us to protect that data and make sure that we're protecting it against a risk of unauthorized deletion or modification. So that's not necessarily a new concept to the organization. That may already have practices and policies and processes in place for other data types that exist in the NERC CIP space. It may just be now leveraging those for a new data set, potentially in a new storage area. All that, of course, is that to say, I've seen organizations that are most successful in their journeys here, both cyber security-based, compliance-based journeys, that rather than treating each new standard or each new project or each new tool as bolt-on, as just we're going to go buy this and throw it in and walk away, we check the box, we're done, is to find a way to integrate those things into a more holistic strategy, into a more holistic process, such that we aren't trying to manage everything as an exception, where everything is unique and everything is different. And of course, that we're monitoring those tools, those processes for gaps, for inefficiencies, and looking to consistently mature them.
Great. And I know, I think the part of the question was about, best practices from a cybersecurity standpoint. I would say, having been doing this for about 8 years on the customer facing side, and previously being in a position where vendors were approaching me in a SOC trying to pitch whatever they thought was the best thing at the time. One thing that I've noticed is always at the top of everyone's list, unless you're going in for an actual incident and there's active malware messing things up. Inventory is always number one, and I don't think that's changed over the years. It's just the way that people are accounting for their devices and systems has grown. So sometimes I'll be doing engagements and things with folks where just the inventory is all usually phase 1, but that may take a year or two before they actually get into the cybersecurity layer, the protection layer, the integration layer. The prevention part usually is towards the end, but without knowing exactly what you have, that's typically the biggest challenge that people have. And then even in just the way that things have changed, from the standards to the detection approach, and even to a cybersecurity cultural piece. At one point, people would only, especially in OT, everything would have to be passive and completely out of not in line with any type of their systems. And I've seen just in the last 5 to 7 years, that whole cultural mindset on maybe a little bit of active is okay, maybe a little bit of scanning, maybe agents on certain types of devices, which was completely unspoken of back then. So like I said, all goes back to inventory, and depending on how lockdown or air gapped in certain standards and devices and rules are in different areas, will determine how good of an inventory picture you get. And sometimes just being able to get one more piece of data, whether it's a serial number or firmware or card information on a backplane PLC or something, just getting that little bit more goes a much further way in terms of protecting and knowing what's out there, and then implementing something that is monitoring all of that traffic. So I think from a holistic point of view, best practice is just knowing what you have, And then once you can fully account and have a system of saying, hey, I know nothing should be added or removed from here, or this device has this kind of life cycle, similar to what Josh was saying about baselining of, there's this type of activity that occurs or shouldn't occur, or this area is more laid back, or this is, critical keys of the kingdom type of devices. Then once you do have a full inventory picture, then you can begin to get further down into the weeds and applying some of these other pieces of the framework.
Great point. Thank you, Ronnie. Yeah, definitely knowing what you have running in your environment is pretty darn critical, I would say. I don't know if you've ever seen what happens in one of these control rooms, but these people, these operators are being deluged with alarms. They get a lot of different distractions. And so one thing that's really important to them is when you do have some of these situations going on in the system, is to make sure that you're giving them only really the true positives. Don't give them false positives, and having a solution in place that can screen out the noise and only find the signal is going to be critical, especially as you're monitoring potentially thousands of devices across your grid. So, and this is getting worse because you get all these DERs coming on now, and so the number of devices that you need to monitor is growing. So thank you, gentlemen. I think that's very insightful. So let's go to the next one. So let's talk about some success stories or use case or case studies for organizations that have effectively implemented the new or similar standards.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I'll start with this one. So with just for legal reasons, I obviously couldn't disclose all the specifics around some of these use cases, but in North America, in the energy sector, of course, and this is why in one of my earlier answers I mentioned encouraging people to put pressure on especially the vendors for what they're providing and what they're able to provide in the future. So this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Started with a proof of concept, typical engagement, RFP, testing a couple different vendors. And this was probably the most complicated RFP and that I had at the time received. And it was, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 pages long of lists, bullet style points of things that were not in the format of must have, nice to have, don't have, but it was all need to have at some point. And this particular organization, they were very forward thinking, or they are very forward thinking in the sense of we have an idea that if we don't do this right today, there will be other standards that come in the future. And if your product doesn't adhere to that, then we'll be back to the drawing board, or we'll be stuck with something under contract for whatever years we get it, and it doesn't check some of the boxes we need. And Nozomi is a startup, and back then we were even smaller. We took on the challenge of saying yes to a lot of those things on the RFP without actually having something in place, but we didn't take it on in the sense of we just want to do this because customer wants us to. We took it on as, this is a good opportunity for us to expand our footprint and really to put ourselves more into the CIP and FERC and NERC community to actually make a product that's more helping people that will have similar asks as this customer did. And these were a range of things, from hardware that needed to be hardened and ruggedized and having certain types of connections and power supplies and being able to operate within certain temperatures and vibrations, as well as to more specific technical things like integrations with certain types of devices, certain protocols, grabbing certain things actively over certain protocols versus passively. So it was a big task for us to take that on. But looking back now, you know, it kind of gave us a roadmap of things to do that we may have not been thinking of at the time. So it was a good story in terms of forming a relationship where, you know, if there's a problem, we're in a position that we can use resources to solve it, and this company as well as others can benefit from it. So it was really good in that sense. And then once they did get audited, there was nothing from the Nozomi side that triggered anything. It was more so things that were in progress or that were being phased out as they were refreshing some of their equipment in that case. But that's one specific use case. And there's others, usually not as complicated, but it's more so, you know, once we did so much work with this one customer, other folks would come and ask maybe, let's say 10% of the things they did. And it's like, oh, you know, well, we've already have this in the books. We've already done this. We're already compliant. We have these frameworks in place. And that a lot of times was more than enough because a lot of people, at least when we engage, it's more so just to know that, okay, you do build your product around these CIP initiatives, as well as it's something that you're focusing on, so we don't really have to. So it was very good for us, and still is something that, like I said, we continue to build our platform with that in mind, and it also gives the folks that we work with the chance to kind of help us build the tool to their likings as well. So like I said, that relationship, having that and not being afraid to put pressure on, you know, us or EY or whoever to really answer your questions or get things done in a manner that satisfies the requirements.
Yeah, we've worked with a couple different clients here that are at various stages in their journey. Those that have either deployed some network-based monitoring solutions in, you know, focusing a little bit more on the field environment, since I think that's kind of the new case study, more so than some of those control center environments that are may already have things in place. But for those field environments, even talking to some clients today about what that strategy could look like going forward, for more than just what the standard currently requires in terms of, you know, just these locations, but maybe across a broader footprint, just based on risk profile and making sure they're ahead of things. I think especially when we're looking at transmission environments, you know, our transmission substations can be in some fairly remote locations and can be a little bit more challenging to get to physically if we're looking at deploying a decentralized solution model. So there's certainly the aspect of, and we talked about it earlier, yeah, there's time before some of this becomes required, but we're probably going to need it. You know, if we have a larger organization that is looking to get to several hundred, if not 1,000 field locations to deploy some new technology and integrate that into their environment, there's only so much you can do in a given, you know, week or a given month or a given year. So it's just going to take time to get that deployed over an entire environment, get it part of the architecture, get it part of the practice and the process, get it operating to make sure that once something does become required for compliance, that we have it effectively implemented and not just implemented. And so we've seen some of our clients start to go through that journey or recently complete that journey as far as addressing the cybersecurity controls and aspects, and now it's going to be folding in some of the compliance aspects into that as well. On a slightly different angle, I think the generation space is probably a little bit further behind, and that's just where we have more OEMs involved and where some of those networks are and the OEMs are more protective of, we've got a model and an architecture that we can deploy, and we know how it works and we know how it functions, and we don't want to mess with it if it's working and functioning the way we designed it. And so even the prospect of deploying even some of the passive solutions that we can look at just need to go through some testing and some proving out before we get to a point where we're comfortable in a production environment, putting some of those practices in place and making sure that we're not going to have any adverse effects to anything operational, anything reliable, reliability sake, or even, you know, of course, most importantly, nothing that's going to present a safety impact to any of the personnel. So definitely have those examples of where we've helped our clients as they've looked at that journey, as they've begun to deploy these technologies. We've got some of those success stories from other sectors outside of P&U, outside of maybe energy, where some of these strategies have already been implemented that we can learn from a little bit, understanding that the operational nature, the reliability nature, and even the regulatory nature of P&U is going to present its own challenges. We have some of the cybersecurity lessons learned to apply.
Thank you. So we also are asking questions around how companies are planning to implement INSM solutions to satisfy NERC CIP requirements. And I would say even more importantly, you know, how do they start to approach the detection of these cybersecurity risks that exist there in addition to those requirements?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger challenges for especially for medium or larger sized organizations is that you're going to have multiple control centers, you're going to have multiple data centers, multiple field locations, and while we like to think that some of these start to get deployed and some of these, even from an architecture perspective, look the same, in a lot of cases they're not. And while we don't want to potentially try to architect and develop purely unique solutions for every single environment we have to protect, we have to start evaluating what the pros and cons are of what a centralized model would look like versus a decentralized model, where cost might be a consideration, of course, where bandwidth considerations might be, of course, a part of it. So there's all of these factors that are going to need to go into just the planning phase of an organization who's trying to meet some of these obligations and trying to meet these security controls, potentially for the first time. There's going to be the different methods that are going to be available to an organization, whether we're talking about collecting network logs and PCAPs and, you know, connecting to mirror or span ports throughout our networks, whether we're looking at passive sensors that can be deployed within our environments, whether we're looking at endpoint enabled solutions that might have those security considerations built into the platforms. But probably more likely, what does a comprehensive or combination solution look like? Because it may not just be one of those things for any one organization. So then it's going to rely on the organization to be able to thoughtfully analyze all of those risks, all of those considerations throughout all of their environments, and again, be able to then demonstrate through audit, you know, what does, how are those data feeds being monitored, and how does that risk-based rationale actually get deployed in the real world and in a real environment?
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.
Ronnie?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say I agree with what Josh was saying, and the way that I tend to think of it is from the different stakeholders' perspectives, right? So, you know, you have the utilities and that have to know, we talked about before, from an inventory, assess what's there. And then you have, you know, your cybersecurity teams, your SOC folks, who obviously would need training, they need preparation, they need staff, they need expertise. Then you have the regulators, the NERC FERC folks who are developing the guidelines and everything that we're adhering to. And then you have folks like me on the vendor contractor side that are trying to work with all these groups, as well as educate, as well as have something from a product standpoint to help do this and satisfy all the requirements. So really, trying to merge all those to one happy family, as well as, still making progress, is where I see, this happening and satisfying those requirements.
So, Ronnie, I'm going to put my old ISO New England hat on, and I'm going to ask you then, if I was looking at this today, so I understand that compliance is coming, but cyber risk is here today. And that's the one that can really cause me the most harm. So if I was to look for or begin to think about how to apply this monitoring a solution in my OT environment, how would you recommend I go about that today?
Yeah, so from a monitoring perspective, and I know this is mentioned a few times, of having intrusion detection systems. Obviously, Nozomi itself is one. There are others out there in the field, but I can only speak on Nozomi. But the point is, there should be some sort of investment or placement of an individual intrusion detection system. As we all know, the cliche, there's no silver bullet to cybersecurity, that is true. So we're not necessarily looking to replace or rip anything out, but every tool, every platform does have its place in the stack, right? So if you're looking to, monitor OT environments, Nozomi itself, that's our bread and butter for 10 years plus. That's where vendors, we reverse engineered parse protocols, partnered with folks like EY, Energy Central, other big, small, medium names to get to this point of understanding a wide range of just OT protocols, as there are hundreds and they're not all the same. And then addressing different challenges is having a network-based platform. Everything in OT doesn't have an IP address, and then some things were birthed without one, and then at some point we decided to put an IP address on some of these devices. So in order to really understand and monitor them, that does take a lot of heavy lifting, which is why, a regular IDS versus an OT IDS is completely different. So when you get into the weeds of, serial connections, unique protocols, different vendors, encapsulated traffic, different tweak protocols or specific ones for like government agencies and things like that. You really want to have a mature knowledge base, as well as someone that's working with the EYs, the Energy Centrals as well, to say, hey, we can't necessarily do everything, but when we work together as a collective, we're able to check off not only product boxes, but compliance boxes, as well as professional services and management pieces. So that's, like I said, our bread and butter. I would start at looking there, and then expanding to ask, okay, outside of that, what can my IDS do for me that I may not be thinking about today?
Great, thanks for that. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So the FERC INSM order calls for greater monitoring to detect malicious activity in OT environments. How does the Nozomi offering satisfy this need?
Sorry, let me unmute again. Yeah, so the way that we do that is, we have passive sensors that can be placed as low as level 0 on a Purdue model scale, up to level 5. And getting that traffic, typically we would start passively, depending how rich it is and how close we're getting to those field devices. We can see IO points and digital connections, RTU, that different level of detail. And rather than just seeing it, you do get that inventory piece, but on the next step down of the anomaly detection neural network piece of, hey, this sensor or the speed of this belt or this fan or the levels in these tanks usually are operating between these values. We see that, maybe it's a little less or more. And the purpose of that is, to obviously proactively give kind of a predictive maintenance or predictive analytics to say things are still functional, which operation is the biggest part for OT to keep things running. Things are still functional, but they may be behaving a little bit different. Rather than waiting for something to fail or to, hugely affect production, let's throw this alert or get in touch with these analysts or this group to say, hey, you might want to check into this. So that's how, from an OT perspective, we do that. There's a lot of different ways from deployment wise, but just understanding those devices, how they behave, how they should speak, how they should interact with each other, or externally, if there is a reason, then that's where we would start with that.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. This is one of the questions I had when I read the FERC order 887, and they talked about defining or identifying a baseline. I thought, good God, that's going to be really hard, because anything can change what's happening on that system. A patch to a router can change, a patch to an RTU. These things can alter what actually happens on the network and within the system itself. So having the ability to see what's actually happening and then ascertain whether or not those anomalies are expected or not expected, which would be the bad guys at work, having that ability would be incredibly valuable, in my opinion. Thanks. So moving on here. Okay, so let me see. I want to make sure I haven't missed anything here. We gotta go through our script correctly here. So Nozomi recently announced an embedded software sensor for detecting malicious activity in OT endpoints. How will this technology be implemented by end users, and how do you see this evolving?
Yeah, so I see this evolving kind of just as I've seen the OT detection process even before I joined Nozomi, right? Like I said earlier, OT, old school OT folks would typically get very possessive of their networks and systems and devices. So, anything new or changing or being added to it was typically frowned upon. And then we got to a point where, there was things like Stuxnet and other things that kind of pushed us to say, all right, we know these devices weren't made with security in mind, but we need to actually monitor them even if we think or believe that things are air gapped. So positive detection came, and at one point passive detection came. And at one point that was the only thing that people would be interested in. And with passive, right, it's just however rich the data in those packets are is what you get, right? There's no scanning or asking or querying or getting anything other than what's there. So in the early days, it was referred to as kind of like a Wireshark on steroids of what we were doing. So looking at all the packets. And then as vendors themselves, I believe are the ones who initiated this. So Siemens, the Schneiders, the Rockwells, as they were refreshing their hardware, they started making them a little smarter with other capabilities. So things no longer had to only be passive. So we also, on the vendor side, adjusted our tool and the way that we detect things to giving it an active option where you can query a device and say, hey, PLC, what's your serial number that wasn't seen in the packet? So it'll ask you that over the protocol that it speaks, or, workstation, what level of Windows is on this, blah, blah, blah. And then that continued to evolve into agents, which can go on certain workstations. And now the feedback that we got from the agents on workstations was so good that we had a vendor that said, hey, is there a way that rather than have these agents on workstations, can we put those directly on an OT device, so PLC, because some of the characteristics of PLCs aren't all going to be translated through network packets, right? Like if it's not encapsulated serial or other pieces that don't have an IP address, you know, if there's a way to put an agent on there, how would that help? So through lots of R&D and working with this particular vendor, we created an embedded OT sensor. So when customers are buying or refreshing their hardware, getting newer PLCs and OT equipment, they can also buy it with this option of this OT embedded IDS already on it. So that also eliminates some of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of getting access to tap into areas, to get traffic, to send it to an IDS or an IPS or whatever. If it's already embedded on the equipment itself, that's one or a few less steps that folks would have to take. So that's one of the newest pieces with endpoint. And how do I see this evolving? I do see it as just like at one point, partially or fully active stuff in OT was kind of seen as territory that no one wanted to go to. Now it's more relaxed under the right circumstances. I do kind of see kind of this cycle when it comes to OT. So it's very fresh, and as things are fresh, there's going to be early adapters and people who are interested in at least seeing what it's like, and then there's going to be hesitation. But once you get more vendors, more testimonials, more stories, and more actual good instances of it working and working properly, I do think the temperature will be a little more relaxed as time comes. So I think that's just all the nature of, you know, technology, and as we're seeing with Industry 4.0 and automation and everything, that's just culturally where we're going.
Yeah, I certainly see, you know, security being something that's embedded by design, whether we're talking about an endpoint, whether we're talking about an architecture, is always going to be in that plus column. It's always going to be great. Let's keep doing that. But with all things security, there's not going to be that silver bullet. It's not going to be great. My device is secure by design. I install it. Now I don't have to worry about it. Nothing's ever that easy in our world, and especially as the technology of our OT environments continues to evolve. We were going from, especially in the power and utility industry, going from electromechanical devices. Now we're going to more digital devices, but we're also going to virtual devices, and we're going to cloud-based solutions. So we're trying to keep up, right? We're always trying to be ahead of the curve when it comes to, great, let's keep securing the things that we have and in the environments we have, but also make sure that we're keeping an eye on where those evolutions are happening with the technology itself, such that we're continuing to embed security in those solutions. Compliance, of course, doesn't always act as quickly as either the threat or the security world wants to evolve, but certainly as the industry has their eye on less physical boxes and more virtual or cloud-based environments, something to consider. Or even not only the operational environment that could be cloud-based, but the security solution itself that might be cloud-based, and how that gets appropriately addressed in the security and the compliance worlds.
This reminds me of an old saying that change is the only constant. And I think this is entirely true, especially when you consider that we are in the throes of an energy transition. As you pointed out, Josh, we're starting to see more and more digital services on the system. Inverter-based resources, those are all driven by software. And software has potential vulnerability risks. And there's a need to know what's happening at those devices and the ability to monitor what's happening there from inside the view of the devices themselves, which I think is what Ronnie was suggesting, is going to be invaluable. Just knowing, if it's under attack. So this is something I think we're going to see more of. Okay, let's move on. So, how do you foresee the NERC CIP 15 standards evolving in the future to keep pace with technological advancements?
Yeah, I think this touches on a few of the things that we've been talking about and we've been discussing. Certainly one potentially predictable outcome is, I had mentioned right now that the standards are flexible and the standards are ambiguous by design. And that's potentially something that evolves to a point where it needs to be more prescriptive based on how it actually gets deployed, how it gets implemented throughout the industry. We just talked about cloud-based solutions and software platforms and operational environments, and whether we're talking about inverter-based resources or other parts of the grid transition, needing to adapt to those environments, and those are areas of CIP that, while may not necessarily be allowed or applicable today, certainly as FERC entertains a lot of the conversations, as we look at the potential reliability impact of the grid itself, certainly something that's part of the equation and part of the conversation as well. But then even within the environment that NERC and FERC do currently regulate, the standard as it's drafted focuses on our control centers, high and medium, and it focuses on our medium facilities that have external connectivity. It doesn't touch on the fact that there are low control centers. It doesn't touch on the fact that there are low field assets that have external network connectivity, not in a capital defined sense, but in a just that connectivity and capability. There's medium impact locations that have networks, just that those networks may not necessarily communicate in a bi-directional way with an outside environment. But that doesn't mean that some of these security risks aren't present and don't need to be addressed. So certainly an area that we can also potentially predict that the CIP 15 standards are going to potentially evolve in the future is then getting applied to some of these environments that exist today that aren't required to have those controls. And those types of things come out through FERC audits and NERC reviews, where they see how the controls are being applied, how they're not being applied, and where risk may still be present. The NOPR that got this whole thing kicked off talked about evaluating whether or not we should apply these controls at lows. The decision was made for the time being, let's not focus on those. But that tends to be a delay and not necessarily an end conclusion or an end decision that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and how I see things evolving in the future, I see it kind of what both of you have said at one point in terms of, we feel like we're playing catch up a lot of times. I think things will continue to kind of push whatever the boundary or standard is at the time, where, like I said before, it used to be passive only, then active and cloud and on-prem and versus, agents. I think it'll continually kind of push to what's next, and it may not be anything that we really can control, because when I think of some of the different field sites that I've been to, for example, let's say warehouses for mass producing cars, or an Amazon type place, there's a lot of automation, a lot of robotics, there are a lot of independent devices that are using a slew of different protocols outside of the ones that we know of when you get into like wireless and other animals that we haven't really began to attack yet from a network perspective. So I do see in the future us having to expand and create and come up with new standards and procedures as the world and these devices continue to mature. Almost seem like they come from nowhere. So me personally.
So thank you guys. So I think I think Josh may have mentioned it earlier about other activities, other regulations that are also impacting utilities. For example, you know, you look at some of the work going on with NERC, and you look at some, and you mentioned the CIRCEA law for incident reporting. So, you know, there are other regulations that are coming, like the SEC is a great example of one. If you're a public company, like let's say Southern Company, if you have a breach, you're subject to the SEC regulations as well. So it's not like you just have to satisfy this one little area of CIP 15. It's really a challenge to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements, and CIP 15 is one. But you know, there's others that are coming that you should expect to prepare for as well. And CIRCEA is certainly one of them. And this is a case where having this information, I think, from your logs and your information that the IDS provides can be very useful if you have to go before a regulator. So the other question that people seem to be asking about is, you know, whether or not this network security monitoring should go beyond just the hardwired networks and include wireless networks as well. And here it's not just, I'm not just talking about Wi-Fi here. I'm talking about, for example, 900 megahertz and microwave communications, which are really all over the utility industry. So, Ronnie, do you have any insight to share with us on what your thoughts are about wireless network monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. This also is something that we've heard a lot in the field from our existing customers, and like I said, Nozomi, we've always been a customer, what they say, customer obsessed product, which means, you know, we do have good ideas ourselves, but a lot of those do come from people and folks and customers of ours saying, hey, it'd be cool if, you know, I could get visibility into this. And what we've done is added a new piece to the product specifically for wireless. I don't believe there's anyone that's really stepping into that arena yet or focusing on it, but we call it Guardian Air. And what that does, it's for, obviously it will detect and monitor things like Wi-Fi, Zigbee, Bluetooth, but also cellular, drones, wireless HART for OT and IIoT devices. And with that, it's a completely different level of use cases that we see, because, you know, the typical OT use cases are always going to be there, but now when you bring wireless into it, for example, if there's certain sites where there's devices or tablets that are supposed to stay there, whether it be for hotel management or you know, manufacturing certain parts, and how many times have employees or ourselves, we forget, oh, this is in my pocket, and you go to lunch or you go to this other part of an area. Now being able to see, hey, this device has moved, or if you're in hospitality, that a customer left the USB key plugged in, maybe to be able to centralize it and say, hey, this is on this floor of this east wing of this hotel. So doing that, as well as on a C-level point of view, let's say, you know, you're working in a certain government agency, and everything that we have from our watches, I have a smart ring, you have all kinds of devices that can communicate with the internet. Depending on what's going on in that meeting, you know, I've been on sites where literally I've had to put all this in a bucket, a container, can't come in, can't go out. But sometimes people forget, but there's nothing really monitoring to ensure that anything that has those level of communications is or isn't there, right? You know, some folks in OT are manufacturing and doing things that let's say you're manufacturing weaponry or things that can explode, having those communications can affect that process of, interfering with it. So it sometimes can be very critical to make sure that there's no access or there's nothing able to communicate. So the point of that wireless piece, like I said, the use cases are different. It's very early. We just announced it a few months ago, but it's made with our kind of in the future of what people will be asking or wanting to have next. So we do at Nozomi believe wireless, cloud, embedded OT is kind of the future, as well as the existing previous OT detection platforms and plans. They're not going anywhere as well. But we do think we want to be more proactive than reactive. So that's why.
Thank you, Ronnie. So I don't know, I may have to buy a software product like yours for myself, just to prevent any pagers from blowing up on me. So, yeah. Whoever knew that a pager could be a weapon of war? Anyways, okay, so we do have a few audience questions, guys. Are you ready for them?
Let's do it.
All right. So one question was, how does Nozomi handle learning environments with duplicate IP addresses, given that OT systems and utilities typically have duplicate IPs?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, because that's one of the things that people ask us before implementing or testing. And if you're, especially the very legacy and traditional OT companies, they stand up their sites, as I like to call mirrored sites. So even though the sites may be completely different, I've been in places where it's the same exact hardware, sometimes the same exact IP and naming convention of their host as another, just because it was done a long time ago and it's always been the case. So if site A, B, C mirror each other, and now you're having a monitoring tool on top of it, how is this monitoring tool going to distinguish that device 1 at site A is not the same as device 2? And there's a number of different ways we do that. Obviously with it being a network tool, we would see unique things, indicators, whether it be the site it came from, the switch, spam port, as well as the hardware info. So the serial numbers, the MAC address, all those are key indicators. But we do also have a few cases where customers actually wanted to merge all those. So there's an option within the tool to say, hey, keep duplicate IPs as separate individual assets or nodes, or merge them all together. So you do have the option for both, but by design, we expect that. Like I said, we started in OT, so that was kind of a commonality that we saw. So we built the tool around to be able to distinguish, mirrored sites.
Yeah, that whole area, I'm glad you brought that up. This concept of secure by design is getting a lot of traction right now. And I think some of that has been coming from the consumer side. I know that INGA, the Interstate National Gas Association, has announced that they're now going to expect vendors to follow secure by design principles and practices. So that's a really good point, Ronnie. Thanks for bringing that up. And another question we have is, what is your opinion of an OT-focused software-defined network implementation to meet INSM? And here they're specifically asking, about using deny by default traffic control, so that you only know what you have on your network.
Yeah, with something like an SDN and an OT network, I imagine while that sounds great, sounds like a promising ability to solve and meet INSM, probably the more challenging metric of that is going to be on the operational side. and that we're not going to impair or affect any operational performance as a result of attempting to implement a security control. But again, I think it would be great. It would certainly meet some of the asks and some of the concerns that we've been talking about. It's just going to be, and especially with the OT environments, there's a delicate balance between safety, between operations and security. And we don't want to potentially sacrifice the success of a safe and operational reliable grid for the sake of cybersecurity, although understanding that they're all very important elements.
Okay, thank you. We do have a few more, so let me go ahead and get to those. So this is one, this is timely. In reference to thousands of devices and pagers incidents, like like impact on hardware, battery, and power supplies and capacitors, how could we avert and possibly monitor the ways this could possibly be avoided?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. I think that one is still things that we're kind of learning and figuring out. But depending on the device, this is where that wireless piece could come into play, right? Because to set off any of those pagers and those incidences, I'm assuming it was through wireless signals, and there's some kind of, whether it's a beacon or hey, I'm alive, or status, there's something in the background running that could be detected if there was something or someone looking for those types of protocols, right? And I don't, like I said, in these days, I don't think many people have really thought down that rabbit hole, especially because, we tend to forget about security on our personal devices, the way that we look at it for OT and other pieces. But the risk is still there. One of the most common things I've seen since we've deployed our wireless piece in the field is rogue cell towers, where you can have someone sitting in a parking lot of an organization with, just novice hacker equipment, a Wi-Fi pineapple or a fake wireless spoofing thing that makes it look like an AT&T cell tower. So now your cell phone connects directly to that instead of AT&T, and they just sit there and sniff and listen or inject things back to your device that could initially make it not usable, spam it with, I've seen Flipper Zero things where they will bring up all types of Bluetooth connections, even though I'm not trying to connect to anything. So I don't think anyone's really looking to protect against that. But in that, what you mentioned, the pager incidences, those are all wireless channels and protocols that they're using. So I think a product like the Guardian Air piece to monitor wireless is a good first step, but just like every other tool, it's more than just, okay, this is here, this is here, now what can I do to prevent or stop, bad things from happening? So we're on the right path, but we're not 100% there yet.
Yeah, I'd also add in that, without, getting too much into speculation, especially with the very recent events, certainly an aspect that it feels like and sounds like could have contributed is supply chain, security and supply chain risks. And there's an aspect that is cross-sector and cross-function where we talk about knowing who you're doing business with, knowing how those systems are being architected from a hardware, from a software perspective, knowing what you're buying, knowing what you're getting, testing the security of those things before you're just putting them in your environment, and trusting that the vendors that you're working with are always doing the right things and always doing the secure by design. certainly we're like Ronnie mentioned and Dick, you mentioned too, we're moving in that right direction. But there's, still potential vulnerabilities, and there's still ways to exploit those areas that we need to be aware of and we need to protect against.
Totally agree. Yeah, when I talk to people about this, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, guys. I'm a software engineer, but when I talk to people, I tell them there's really 3 different attack paths that are most commonly used. One is people, phishing and so on and so forth. 2 is software vulnerabilities, and 3 is the supply chain, as Josh just mentioned. And it seems to be pervasive. I hear this in the healthcare community, I hear it in manufacturing, I hear it in energy, I hear it, all over the place, really. So you make an excellent point, Josh. We do have another question. So, does digital twin help to protect against cyber attack?
So I'll start with that, but yeah, I would say yes. And if anyone out there isn't familiar with digital twin, it's like making a replica of a city or an entity with the hopes of, let's say you're the city of Miami looking for a product. Rather than implementing this product, you have a digital twin, which is kind of a virtual entity of that city and what's being used in it. So I look at digital twin kind of like high availability, not 100% the same, but somewhat similar, where it's like, well, high availability in OT is if this goes down, backup kicks in and you don't lose anything, you remain operational. This isn't the same in that sense because nothing has to go down, but it's almost giving a realistic full test environment, or as accurate as you could get then to the real world, right? So I always will advocate for anything in those digital twin high availability type of instances, because it's better to test and figure things out as much as you can there before deploying something in the real world and then running into some challenges that could have been avoided with a little more testing.
Yeah, I see your point, Ronnie. It is really about business continuity. But I think going back to some of the things we said earlier, there's plenty of evidence. This is not theoretical. This is hypothetical. This is happening today, these risks. And you don't have to look far to see it. We heard about the Navy destroyer that had a Starlink access point installed. Oops, now we know where that chip is. Oh boy, that's not good. And the Army just announced that many soldiers are bringing their smartwatches to work. And that can also open up some challenges as well, because that's wireless, some wireless traffic that could be generated. And if it can be detected, it can help to understand where your potential vulnerabilities may reside. So having this visibility, like Ronnie said, is going to be vitally important in order to help protect and defend against cyber attacks. We do have one more question before we're getting close to our end here, guys. So one question that came up is, what advice would you offer to someone that's graduated from college or is looking to get into the cybersecurity space? What advice can you give them?
Definitely an interesting question, and appreciated. I'm gonna show my age here a little bit. Cybersecurity wasn't a degree offering when I was in school, so it was something that I learned through application, through hands-on experience. I think me and peers that I was working with, we were all learning it at the same time. So having a network of people to lean on in that situation as well. And certainly everyone's going to have different learning styles. There are those who might, benefit from conversations and panels, discussions like this to broaden their experience and get their thought process going and do more, self-learning and research. And those that do get better experience and more advantage out of just going into a field environment with a job opportunity, internship, whatever it might be, and learn, on the job with others who have been doing this work for the past several years.
Great.
Yeah, and for me, I think they started offering cybersecurity as a major the year after I graduated, but it was a minor when I was in school. So, but I would say the thing, it goes beyond your education. So once you finish school, that's not it, right? Even my first job interview, they asked, what was I doing since graduating? And, the internet and all the other resources and almost every vendor, new tool, old platform has some sort of a freeware or something where you can, test it out, do some cool things, build out a lab, and just being able to show that, you are still educating yourself more so outside of the textbook, but now into what is actually being used in the field and the products. I think that goes a long way, and that's for the most part free with the different freewares that everyone has. So I would start there and then just keep putting yourself out there and educating yourself as much as you can. And if you can, find a good mentor.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ronnie. In fact, I was just going to say that, look around your environment, look around your local community, because I know in our case up here in Massachusetts, we have a Mass Cyber Center that operates this mentor program for cybersecurity. And I'm one of the mentors there, and I can tell you that it's really, really gratifying. You bring in a student and you teach them something about what you're working on or what's coming down the pipe as a futuristic technology that might help them get better positioned to get a good paying job. So it's not just about, knowing who to contact, but also getting that network in place and getting getting the mentors, like you said, Ronnie, and connecting to the community. This is valuable. So we have reached the end of the regular program. So at this point, I think, Ronnie, there we go. Okay, so PJ, thank you for bringing that up. You guys have been great. This has been very informative, and I appreciate you taking the time out today. But we do have some resources, so we have Ronnie to thank for that. So I'm going to go ahead and let Ronnie tell you about these.
Yeah, and some of these are referred to during some of my answers as well. But we do have a NERC CIP mapping guide and how it aligns with, from that IDS checkbox, if you were going by the INSM standards. It is a good place to see, what else you're okay with versus what you would need in addition to an IDS. We've built all that out already. And then the second blog on the right that was published last week, which also had some key pieces. One of my favorite parts of it is there's a stakeholder chart that breaks it down into 4 types of stakeholders and the strengths and weaknesses of each and how to prepare for them in the solution. So both quick reads, good material. If you have any other questions about it, I believe my information's at the bottom of the one, and if not, I'm on LinkedIn. I have a very unique name, so you should be able to find me. And yeah, thank you for joining and asking questions and engaging. But that's all I have on the resources part. So pass it back to you, Dave.
Josh, any last words from you?
No, I certainly appreciate the conversation. Thought it was a good one. Similarly to Ronnie, I can be found on LinkedIn. Don't hesitate to reach out and contact me, and happy to help with any additional questions that you may have. But certainly appreciate the opportunity from you all to participate in today's conversation.
Thank you. So thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your time today. And my advice to you, the folks out there, is get involved. And by all means, look at the things that are happening today that are opening up channels of opportunity. One area is CISA, secure by design principles and practices. This is becoming more important. You see that with some of the announcements coming from vendors and from associations like the Interstate National Gas Association. So, and part of that is knowing how to monitor for cyber risks. And that's what this session was all about today. So PJ, I'm going to pass it back over to you and thank everyone for attending our session today.
Thanks, again. Thanks, Ronnie and Josh. This was a fantastic conversation, and thanks again to Nozomi for making this event possible. For our audience, please look for an email from us containing the link to the replay, and also take a moment to fill out our couple of questions survey at the end. We take your feedback seriously, and sometimes that generates more power sessions to listen to. From everyone here at Energy Central, thank you for joining. We look forward to seeing you at an upcoming power session. Thank you for attending. This does conclude today's presentation.